We are getting some breaking news in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie.
Subscribe right now. Hit that notification bell. Turn on every notification.
At first, it was treated as routine. According to investigators, a secondary review of internal case logs revealed a short window of activity that didn't fully align with the established timeline. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't obvious, but it was enough to raise a question. Because during a period when Nancy Guthrie was believed to be unaccounted for, there appears to have been movement tied to her digital footprint. And that detail, small as it seems, has now shifted attention back to someone who was already under quiet scrutiny: her son-in-law, Tommaso. Based on available information, the early phase of this case followed a familiar pattern. Nancy Guthrie, a woman described by those close to her as consistent and predictable, suddenly became unreachable. No confirmed sightings, no clear indication of departure, just a disruption in routine. Investigators began by reconstructing her last known movements: phone activity, local surveillance, transaction records. At first, nothing stood out. Her phone had gone inactive around the same general time frame initially reported. There were no unusual purchases, no signs of travel arrangements, no immediate indication of distress. But that's where the first layer of concern began to form. Because while her personal activity appeared to stop, other signals didn't. According to investigators, one device associated with Nancy's household network briefly connected to a location outside what was initially considered her likely range of movement. It wasn't her primary phone. And that raised an important question: who was using it? At the same time, attention began to settle on those closest to her family members, including her son-in-law, Tommaso. By all outward accounts, his behavior was steady, present, cooperative. He participated in early discussions. He answered questions when asked. He didn't attempt to avoid attention. And that, investigators noted, made him difficult to evaluate. Because there was nothing clearly wrong. But there was also nothing that fully explained certain timing gaps. The timeline appears to suggest that Tommaso was one of the last people with potential proximity to Nancy before communication stopped. Not confirmed contact, but proximity. And in investigations like this, proximity matters. That's where things began to change. Because as analysts reviewed communication patterns more closely, one detail stood out: a brief gap, not in Nancy's activity, but in Tommaso's. According to available information, there was a period during which his usual digital pattern calls, messages, passive app activity appears to have dropped. Not for long, but long enough to be noticeable when compared to his baseline behavior. Now, on its own, that doesn't prove anything. People disconnect. Devices lose signal. Routine varies. But when placed alongside the broader timeline, investigators are working to understand whether that gap aligns with the moment Nancy's activity stopped. And that overlap, if accurate, introduces a layer of uncertainty, because it raises a question that hasn't yet been answered. What was happening during that window? At the same time, something else began to surface. According to investigators, a vehicle associated with the family may have been captured on traffic cameras in an area not initially linked to Nancy's known movements. The timestamp wasn't flagged at first. It blended in. Routine traffic, no alert. But during a wider review, the vehicle's presence, and more importantly, its direction of travel, didn't fully align with what had been previously understood about that day. And that's where the pattern started to shift. Because now, investigators weren't just looking at absence. They were looking at movement. And movement creates questions. Why that route? Why that time? And who was inside the vehicle? Based on available information, there has been no confirmed identification of the driver from that footage. But the connection was enough to bring Tommaso back into focus. Not as a conclusion, but as a point of analysis. At the same time, behavioral patterns were being quietly reviewed. According to investigators, those close to the situation noted that while Tommaso remained cooperative, there were subtle shifts in how he responded to certain lines of questioning. Nothing direct, nothing that could be isolated as suspicious on its own, but variations. Moments where responses became less detailed, moments where clarification was needed, and in one instance, a timeline reference that appeared slightly inconsistent with earlier statements. Again, small. But in investigative work, small changes matter because they can indicate uncertainty or adjustment. And that's what investigators are working to understand, whether these are natural variations or something else. Then came another detail: digital access logs. According to investigators, a shared account linked to the household showed activity after Nancy was believed to have gone silent. Not extensive use. Used to log in. Brief. Controlled. But enough to suggest that someone was still accessing environments connected to her. And that creates a complication. Because if Nancy was no longer active, then who was? At the same time, that login didn't trigger any alerts. No password changes, no security flags, which suggests familiarity. Whoever accessed it likely knew how to do so without drawing attention, and that narrows possibilities. But it doesn't confirm anything. It just reshapes the questions. And that's where the investigation currently stands. Not at a conclusion, but at a point where multiple small details on their own mean very little. Yet together, they begin to form a pattern that doesn't fully align with the original understanding of events. A digital gap, a vehicle in the wrong place, a login after silence, a timeline that almost fits, but not completely. And at the center of that evolving pattern is someone who, from the beginning, appeared consistent, calm, present, cooperative. Tommaso. But that's not what stands out now. What stands out is what doesn't fully match. Because, according to investigators, one final detail from the most recent review may complicate things even further. A piece of evidence that had been logged early, but only now is being re-examined. And its location does not fully align with where Nancy was believed to be last, which raises a question investigators have not yet answered. If that detail holds, then was the original timeline wrong? Or is there a part of this story that hasn't been seen yet? That detail, the one now being re-examined, was not new. It had been there from the beginning. Logged, tagged, stored, and for weeks, it didn't stand out. According to investigators, it was recovered during an early sweep of an area that was considered peripheral at the time, not central to Nancy's last known movements. Not a primary focus, just part of standard procedure. But now, based on updated timeline reconstruction, that same location is being looked at differently. Because it may not be peripheral after all. It may sit closer to the center of what actually happened. And that changes how everything around it is interpreted. At the same time, analysts began to revisit the sequence of events leading up to Nancy's disappearance. Not just where she was, but who knew where she was expected to be. Because in cases like this, awareness matters. According to investigators, Nancy followed a relatively stable routine. Her movements weren't random. Her schedule, while not rigid, had patterns, which means that anyone close to her, especially someone within the household, could reasonably anticipate her general whereabouts at certain times. And that introduces a possibility investigators are working to understand. If someone had prior familiarity with her routine, then deviations might not appear accidental. They might appear timed. But that's where things become less clear. Because when investigators compared known routine patterns with the current timeline, one section didn't align. A gap. Not just in activity, but in expectation. Based on available information, there appears to be a period where Nancy's expected movement doesn't match where evidence suggests she may have been. And that mismatch raises a question. Was her routine disrupted, or was it redirected? At the same time, attention returned to the vehicle captured on traffic cameras. Investigators are working to enhance the footage frame by frame, looking for identifiers, reflections, silhouettes, anything that could confirm who was inside. But according to current analysis, the visual data remains inconclusive. No clear face, no definitive confirmation, just a vehicle moving through a location that doesn't fully fit the original narrative. And that's where the focus begins to narrow again. Because if that route wasn't random, then it may connect to something. A destination, a stop, or even a location that hasn't yet been fully examined. At the same time, digital analysts uncovered another subtle pattern. According to investigators, metadata from devices linked to the household suggests that one device may have briefly interacted with a secondary network outside the home. Not a full connection, more like a handshake, a signal exchange. And it happened during a time window that overlaps with multiple points of interest in the timeline. Now, that doesn't confirm movement, but it suggests proximity, because for a device to register that kind of interaction, it typically needs to be within a certain range, which brings up another question. If a device from the household was near that network, who was carrying it, and why? At the same time, investigators revisited earlier statements, not to challenge them, but to compare them against emerging data. According to available information, one detail began to shift under that comparison: a reference to timing. Specifically, when certain movements were said to have occurred, it wasn't a direct contradiction, but it wasn't a perfect match either. And in investigative work, near matches can be just as important as clear discrepancies, because they suggest adjustment, or uncertainty, or incomplete recall. Investigators are working to understand which one applies here. Then there's behavior. Not dramatic behavior, not obvious signals, but patterns. According to investigators, Tommaso's activity in the days following Nancy's disappearance remained outwardly consistent. He communicated. He responded. He remained accessible. But there was one shift, subtle but measurable. His digital activity began to cluster. More interactions in shorter windows, followed by longer periods of minimal engagement. Now, that could mean nothing. People change patterns under stress. Routines shift. But when compared against his baseline behavior prior to the incident, the difference is noticeable. And that raises a question investigators haven't answered yet. Is that change reactive or intentional? At the same time, something else emerged during a secondary review of physical evidence logs. According to investigators, an item originally cataloged without urgency is now being reclassified for further analysis, not because of what it is, but because of where it was found. Its position doesn't fully align with the expected sequence of events, which introduces a new possibility: that the scene, at least in part, may not reflect the original point of disruption. In other words, what if the location investigators focused on first was not where everything began? That possibility shifts the entire framework, because it suggests movement before the moment that was initially identified as critical. And if that's the case, then earlier assumptions may need to be adjusted. At the same time, analysts began mapping out all known signals, digital, physical, behavioral, onto a single timeline, looking for overlap, looking for convergence. And what they found wasn't a clear answer. It was a pattern of near alignments, events that almost match, signals that almost connect, but not perfectly. And that lack of perfect alignment is what's keeping the investigation open, because it suggests that something is missing. A step, a moment, a detail that hasn't yet been fully identified. And that's where the focus now is, filling that gap, understanding what connects these near matches into a complete sequence. Because until that happens, every interpretation remains partial, and every conclusion remains out of reach. But one development quietly noted in the most recent internal review may begin to narrow things further. According to investigators, a previously overlooked time marker has now been isolated, a precise moment, short, defined, and it sits at the intersection of multiple inconsistencies: the digital gap, the vehicle movement, the network interaction. All of them, according to preliminary analysis, may touch that same point in time. And if that holds, then that moment may represent more than just overlap. It may represent the turning point, the exact point where routine ended and something else began. But there's one problem. That moment doesn't match any confirmed account of where anyone involved claims to have been, which leaves investigators with a question they haven't yet been able to resolve. If no one places themselves there, then who was? That question, who was there, has now become central. Because according to investigators, that isolated time marker isn't just another data point. It sits at the exact place where multiple strands of the case begin to overlap. The digital silence. The unexpected movement. The secondary network interaction. All of them appear to pass through that same narrow window. And yet, based on available statements, no one has clearly accounted for it. At the same time, investigators are working to understand whether that moment represents a single event or a sequence compressed into a short span of time. Because the distinction matters. A single event suggests something sudden. A sequence suggests planning. And right now, the data doesn't fully confirm either. So they've gone back again, this time focusing on micro-timing. Seconds, not minutes. According to investigators, when device-level timestamps were examined more closely, one subtle detail began to stand out. A delay. Not a large one, but measurable, between when an action should have registered and when it actually did. Now, delays like that can happen for many reasons: network lag, system buffering, device variation. But in this case, the delay appears to repeat in more than one instance. And that raises a possibility investigators are now considering, that some actions may not have occurred exactly where the data suggests they did. In other words, what looks like a single location in the timeline might actually involve movement between 2 points. And that changes how the sequence is interpreted. Because if movement is involved, then timing becomes everything. At the same time, attention returned once more to the household environment. Not the people, but the space itself. According to investigators, a reevaluation of entry and exit points revealed something that hadn't been fully considered earlier. One access point rarely used showed subtle signs of recent interaction. Not forced, not damaged, just used. And importantly, it doesn't appear in the initial timeline reconstruction, which means one of two things. Either it was overlooked early on, or its significance wasn't understood at the time. Now, investigators are working to determine how that access point connects to the broader sequence. Because if it was used during that critical window, then it may explain how movement occurred without immediately triggering attention. But that leads to another question. Who knew about it? At the same time, analysts revisited the behavioral layer again. This time, not looking for inconsistencies in what was said, but in what wasn't. According to investigators, there were moments during early conversations where certain details were not volunteered until specifically asked. Again, that's not unusual. People don't always recall everything immediately. But when those delayed details are mapped against the evolving timeline, they appear to sit closer to key moments than initially thought, which introduces a subtle shift, not in what is known, but in how it is weighted. Because timing of disclosure can sometimes be as important as the detail itself. And investigators are working to understand whether that applies here. Then there's the question of the vehicle. According to the latest review, enhanced analysis of environmental factors, lighting, traffic flow, background patterns suggests the footage may have been captured slightly earlier than first estimated. Not by much, but enough to move it closer to that central time marker. And if that adjustment holds, then the vehicle's movement may no longer be separate from the digital signals. It may be part of the same sequence, which tightens the timeline and reduces the margin for coincidence. At the same time, a deeper look into device handling raised another possibility. According to investigators, certain interaction patterns, how a device was accessed, how quickly actions were taken, may indicate familiarity not just with the device, but with its settings, its layout, its shortcuts. That doesn't identify a person, but it suggests experience. And that matters, because it narrows the field of who could perform those actions without hesitation. Now, none of this provides a direct answer, but it refines the framework. It removes some possibilities and strengthens others. And increasingly, the focus is not just on what happened, but on how precisely it was carried out, because precision suggests awareness. And awareness suggests intent. But that's where the investigation still holds back. Because intent requires confirmation. And confirmation requires alignment. And right now, alignment is close, but not complete. There is still a gap, a missing link between movement, access, and timing. And until that link is clearly identified, investigators are working within probabilities, not conclusions. But one final development, quiet but significant, may begin to close that gap. According to investigators, a cross-reference between multiple data sources has revealed a narrow overlap in physical and digital presence, a moment where location data, network interaction, and environmental capture all point to the same general area. Not exact, but close. Close enough to suggest that whoever was involved in that moment was not just passing through. They were there with purpose. And that brings everything back to the same unresolved point. Because even with all the refinement, all the reanalysis, all the narrowing of possibilities, one question still hasn't been answered. Not clearly, not completely. If that moment represents the true center of what happened, then why does every version of the timeline avoid it? And more importantly, who is still missing from that picture?